watching in the break the world's most beautiful anchorman, Rachel Maddow, and she's on and she's talking about, I'm trying to get caught up on the Mississippi primary, and she comes on in a very somber, sad, outraged, face and demeanor that Mississippi, this is their first primary that they're enacting the voter ID law, and she's acting like she's surprised or this is something that shouldn't have happened. I don't know exactly what the tone was that she was implying, but she couldn't believe there was an elderly African-American that was turned away at the voter booth because he didn't have an ID. Now, for a woman that supposedly is the smartest person in the media, she's pretty damn stupid when it comes to things like this. What do you think the voter ID law meant, you idiot, you nitwit? It means that you have to show your ID. What are you in such an outrage for and so surprised that somebody in a state where voter ID law has been enacted and you've been screaming for the last 2 years that you don't want this isn't right because people are going to have to show their IDs when they come to the poll? What are you so shocked for that somebody in a state where you have to show your voter ID in order to vote didn't have their ID and you couldn't believe that they were turned away? What do you think is supposed to happen, you moron? That's exactly what the law is for. I mean, I at some point, I cannot believe just the way that they just try and spin any story. I mean, and they can't be that stupid. I don't know if it's just that they're so overwhelmingly sensitive to anything or what exactly it is. But, I mean, I'm looking at this, and you've got to be kidding me. What do you expect? There's a voter ID law now, which means you have to show your ID in order to vote. And what is this she's talking about? An elderly African-American that has voted in elections before? Yeah, no kidding. They didn't have ID law before. He didn't have his ID and he couldn't vote. What do you expect, you idiot? And, this whole argument really needs to start being turned up by the Republicans because it doesn't even make any sense at all. And if you want to talk about racism, how every 2 seconds out of the left, something's racist. I could tell you the last 5 years, the biggest racist argument I've ever heard in my life is voter ID law. That we can't have voter ID because it's going to affect African Americans, and African Americans then are going to be turned away at the polls in droves. Why don't you explain to me exactly what that means? Does that mean that African Americans then don't drive cars usually? Or if they do, then they drive it illegally without a driver's license? What, do they not usually fly because you need an ID to get on a plane? Do they not travel very much? You need an ID to check into a hotel? Do they not have bank accounts because you need an ID to open up a bank? Almost any job that you work for, they require an ID when you first are hired. Are you implying that African Americans don't work? Exactly what is it that African Americans, I'd like to know whatever the reasoning would be out of you, that it would be harder for them to produce an ID? Because the way that I look at it, the voter ID argument is the most racist argument I've heard in the last 5 years in politics. It's incredible. And states have offered up. Now, this is just where there's fraud. I mean, this just shows you that there's fraud. They're fighting the states, the left is, that have offered up notice of a couple of years that you're going to need an ID to vote. And if you can't afford to pay for the ID, they'll pay for the ID. And they'll provide a ride, transportation, to be able to go get your ID. And the Democrats have a problem with that. Why would you have a problem with that? Why would you have a problem with that? Why do you think? Because there's fraud going on. You know there's fraud going on. There's no logical, reasonable person that would oppose that. And the Democrats are. And even when they lose it, as they did in Pennsylvania, they fight it in the courts. Even when it's voted on, they fight it in the courts. Voter ID, and Republicans need to wake up about this too. Because it's not just the people that decide they're going to vote a couple of times. I believe there's an organized effort with it. And both sides do this with the voter registration. But the voter registration just screams, absolutely screams voter fraud. I mean, I was watching on CNN. They did this documentary of the Florida League of Women Voters. And I don't know what that means anyway. Does that mean if they saw me would they not register me since I'm a man? I don't know exactly what the Florida League of Women Voters is. But they were walking around. It was a community event. I don't know if it was a fair, a town day, whatever it was. They were walking around. They had shirts on. Are you registered? They had a clipboard. And if you weren't registered to vote, they were getting your information, then writing your information for you, writing your name, writing your address, writing your date of birth, and then all they had to do was sign it. So I'm watching that, and I'm thinking to myself, you mean to tell me that not only did they not decide to register on their own, that the person is filling out their name for them, their birthday, they can't even do that, all they're doing is signing it, that they care that little about registering to vote, and you mean to tell me that on Election Day they're going to wake up, find out what precinct they're supposed to vote at, drive there, take transportation there, whatever it is, wait in line, and then actually vote? I think that's highly unlikely. Very highly unlikely. So the fact, and both sides do this too, that there's millions and millions and millions of dollars spent on people that can't even register on their own, let alone write their name on the paper themselves. You actually think that they're going to vote? That just screams the whole fraud that there is there. And you take a look at these races that in Philadelphia, Mitt Romney was, I think it was 75 precincts combined. I forget what it was, but 19,000 votes to 0. Mitt Romney didn't get one vote. Mitt Romney didn't get one vote. Get 19,000 people to agree on anything. It's impossible. And in North Carolina, too, by the way, there's no voter fraud that we hear. 35,000 people, they did a study. The North Carolina Board of Elections, after the race in 2012. And remember, North Carolina, that was a swing state, right? Absolutely. 36,750 people. They cross-referenced their database with 20 other states that complied. Now, the 22 states that didn't comply, that could probably be a lot worse. But the North Carolina Board of Elections cross-referenced their voting database with other voting databases, and they found that 37,000 people with the same first name, last name, and date of birth voted in other states. Now, some of that could be a common name and the same birth date. That was probably a handful, maybe a dozen at the most. Now, this is, I would say, impossible. They found that 765 people that voted in North Carolina voted in other states that had the same first name, last name, birth date, and social security number. So you don't think there's a little bit of fraud going on? Of course there's fraud going on. A lot of it, it's organized in the local levels. Of course there's fraud going on. If you, first of all, just the opinion, there's not even a debate whether or not there should be a voter ID. You need an ID to do anything. I had to have an ID to be able to play football back when I was 8 years old, because you had the 65-pound team, you had the 90-pound team, and then they would have people that were kind of 70 pounds coming down playing at the 65-pound level. So you had to be weighed, and you were actually issued an ID from the league. Now, this was when I was 8 years old, so this was in 1990. You had to have an ID to play Pee Wee football back in 1990. But you don't need an ID to vote in 2014. Now, that makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? And then to say that voter ID is racist, I think it's the opposite. I think it's the opposite, Rachel. I think, to be honest with you, it's the most racist argument I've ever heard in politics, to say that voter ID is to suppress the African-American vote. And I would just, I've said my piece here. I'd like to turn it over to the left and explain to me how that's racist. What is it exactly that African-Americans don't do that would not require a ID, that they would normally have an ID? Or what exactly is it that they're not capable of getting an ID? I would just like to throw that to the left, if they could answer that for me.